Hi, guys. Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast, I talk with Ed Bolian, believer, exotic car guy, YouTuber, and previous Cannonball Run record holder. Plus, scripture and nerdy news as always, and we'll get to all of that right after this. Before we get into our interview with Ed, let's do some scripture. With Ed being a car guy, I could do the old jokes and read scripture about cars in the Bible, the disciples being all in one accord, or God driving Adam and Eve out of Eden. But instead, let's read Matthew 22:34 through 40. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." I really love this passage. I'm not much of a debater myself, but Jesus was a master at it. The Sadducees had already failed, and now an expert of the Pharisees steps up to the plate and asks, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Since there were many, a lot more than 10, and many people say 613 now, but Jesus clarifies the whole law in two simple statements: love God, love others. The law had one major purpose: to show us that we cannot save ourselves. There's no way we can follow all the law. Only faith in who Jesus is can save us. Now, if you're listening and maybe you're just checking out this whole Jesus thing, then I'd love to hear from you. I would love to take a journey through the Bible with you to show you who Jesus really is. So, if that's you, feel free to send me an email or message me on the Christian Nerds Unite Facebook page. I would love to talk to you. Now for some nerdy news. During the Monday Night College Football playoffs, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania dropped their new trailer. We get to see Kang in action finally, and Scott Lang appears to have a major ending. It seems clear from the trailer that the main theme is Scott is going to be forced to do things for Kang that he was not okay with, but he had to do them to save his daughter. My biggest concern here is that Kang was expected to be kind of the big bad for this next phase of the MCU, with Quantumania being the first film in Phase 5 and getting a major battle with Kang in this film. It seems too early for me. I know there are multiple Kangs and there are lots of movies ahead, but with this trailer, it feels more like Kang is the bad guy and not the ultimate one for the MCU going forward. Marvel trailers are notorious for being deceptive, so we will have to wait and see. Also, in the new Quantumania trailer, we get our first glimpse of MODOK in the MCU proper. If you're unfamiliar with MODOK, the name is an acronym that stands for Mental Organism Designed Only for Killing. He is basically a huge head and a stunted body who uses a hover chair to get around. In the comics, he's been in charge of AIM, Advanced Idea Mechanics. The character will be played by Corey Stoll, who previously played Darren Cross, aka Yellow Jacket, in the MCU. It is likely that this will be the origin of this new version of the character. If you haven't heard, MODOK recently had a streaming series that is currently available on Hulu, but it was more of an animated comedy. I don't highly recommend it. It's an okay watch, but I feel it did not live up to its potential. Maybe this MODOK will. Director James Gunn has said not all the Guardians of the Galaxy will make it out of Volume 3. And in an interview recently, actor Dave Bautista may have just told us that Drax is one of the ones that's not going to make it. Bautista said, "I'm so grateful for Drax. I love him, but there's a relief that it's over. It wasn't all pleasant. It was hard playing the role. The makeup process was beating me down, and I just don't know if I want Drax to be my legacy. It's a silly performance, and I want to do more dramatic stuff." Batista has already been working on other movies like Blade Runner 2049 and Glass Onion and Dune, and as well has 5 other non-Marvel projects that will be released in 2023, including Dune Part 2 and Knock at the Cabin. I'm really looking forward to seeing his acting future. Ed Bolian is an auto enthusiast, a follower of Jesus Christ, a YouTube celebrity, and in 2013, he broke the Cannonball Run record with a time of 28 hours and 50 minutes and is the founder of VinWiki, an app for seeing car history. I have been watching Ed for some time, and I really enjoy his videos and was super excited to get to talk to him finally. Well, let's get right into the interview. Ed Bolian, it is great to have you on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast today. I'm so excited to have you here. I have been watching VinWiki and your Car Trek videos for a year or two now, and I have really, really enjoyed what you're doing on the internet. And it was super exciting when I connected with you and was able to get you on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, so some of our podcast listeners may not be familiar with you. You give us the short version of who Ed Bolian is and why might they have heard of you before?
Well, there you go. So I'm Ed Bolian. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up not necessarily loving cars. I actually loved reptiles and everything else that you could do outside a youth group as much as I could manage. But went to Georgia Tech, ended up starting an exotic car rental company there, became the director of sales at Lamborghini Atlanta for a little while. And then we started an app called VinWiki, which is kind of a crowdsourced version of Carfax. And about a year in, this was in 2017, it wasn't growing all that well. And so we started a YouTube channel to promote it where me and my friends tell car stories every day. And so we've got about 1.5 million subscribers now and get about, 300,000-400,000 views a day and have a whole lot of fun. And so me and some of my car YouTuber friends, we do some collaborative projects like Car Trek, which is essentially a sponsor allowing us to play Top Gear, which if you asked me if I could go pro in anything, that would have been the answer.
Awesome. Well, you're also known for one other thing. For a while, you held the Cannonball Run time, correct?
I did, yes. I was the fastest person to drive from New York to Los Angeles from 2013 until 2019.
Well, you kind of alluded to some of the things you've done there, and you mentioned that exotic cars wasn't really your thing when you were younger, but that's kind of your thing now. But you have kind of a special connection with exotic cars. You don't always tend to buy the best examples, shall we say.
Exactly. And in the same way that when we say we love God, it doesn't mean the same thing when everybody says it. When we say we love cars, it doesn't mean the same thing when everybody says it. I love driving cars. I love the stories of cars. And so what that tends to mean is that the best cars for me to buy are the worst ones on earth. Now, hopefully they're the worst examples of the coolest cars on earth. I would say that's kind of my brand of car buying, but I love cars that have had terrible pasts. I love cars that need some love and rehabilitation in order to be drivable, because then when you drive them, they go up in value. And that's sort of been the secret. Like, I don't actually have a lot of money. I have great credit and I have the ability to enjoy really, really bad examples of really cool cars. And I've done that over and over again. But, like my favorite car that I've ever owned was a Lamborghini Murcielago that was abandoned in the middle of a highway after it was crashed by a drunk 15-year-old because he was hiding it from the Canadian cops as that he and his father-in-law or the father of his baby mama was in the process of operating a car dealership that they would use to smuggle drugs across the Canadian-American border through car auctions. So his job as a 15-year-old was to stuff drugs into the frame rails of cars, sell them through auctions. And the whole reason that his father-in-law was in Canada was that he was kicked out of Iran for terrorist activities. And so I bought and fixed that car and drove it like a Camry and had a blast.
Now, is that been your favorite car to own? Is there a particular car that stands out? Because you've owned a lot of cars.
I have, yeah. I've been through a lot of cars, and I would say yes, to be quite honest, but partially because of the nature of what that is. So that was a manual transmission Lamborghini Murcielago LP640 coupe, which will mean absolutely nothing to 99.9 repeating % of your viewers, but it's the best naturally aspirated V12 car short of a $20 million McLaren F1 that was ever built. And there's less than 100 of them worldwide. And I learned that they were far more rare than the world at large thought they were. So like, for instance, we thought that there was about 5% real stick shift manual cars as opposed to the paddle shift cars as they started to be made in the 2000s. And it was my personal favorite car because it was released when I was 16 years old. And so at that time, it set the fastest 100 miles and the fastest 100 kilometers and the furthest distance driven in an hour. And so they built the cars from 2001 to 2010. And the best version of it is really the LP640. And so I started to figure that out, and I started making a list of them. And the factory didn't even have a list. Like I asked them that because I worked for a dealership. I was like, how many did you build that were this? And they said, well, we don't even know what that means. And I said, well, how many of them have part of the VIN says this? And they're like, we don't have the ability to search for that. And I said, well, can you go into this software on this system and do that? And they said, no. And so I started building the list. And so I had found a really, really perfect example of one. And I got a loan for 100% of the purchase price and just had a gigantic car payment and had my dream car. But like after I left the car dealership, I didn't make any money for 2 years. And having a multi-$1,000 car payment is a bad idea, according to Dave Ramsey, in that circumstance. And so I kind of had this weight that I had a 1-year-old child, a giant car payment, a car that was really expensive to own and operate. And I also had the superpower of all things to know where all the rest of them were. And so I knew that this car with this terrible past, and at that time, all I knew is that it had been crashed and abandoned in the middle of a public highway and then on the news. And I bought that car for less than I made telling the world how rare the really nice one was. So I got the worst version of my dream car for free, which is as cool as it gets. So it was, I would say, of all the cars that I've owned and had, it would be either that one or the Paris Hilton SLR as my favorite ones in terms of the story, at least.
How much of it is that you really want the car, and how much of it is that you want the story attached to the car?
You know, it's kind of equal. I'll be honest. Like, it needs to be a car that I kind of want to buy, but at the same time, I bought a lot of cars that I probably didn't really want just because the story was so incredible. Last year I bought a Lamborghini Gallardo out of the Virginia State Police impound that had been stolen, spray painted orange, the VIN swapped, smelled awful, barely ran. Now it was dirt cheap, so I primarily bought it because it was a $35,000 running and driving 2013 Lamborghini that would normally be worth like $125,000. But like I wasn't out looking for a Gallardo at that point, and so there's kind of that trifecta. If it's got a great story, if it's something I already wanted, and if it's cheap, I am in. And I guess who wouldn't be? And honestly, that was kind of the circumstance I found, is that everybody else was like, why can't I find $30,000 Lamborghinis? And so I had a contest of sorts where I let our viewers make a video about what they would do if they bought a $35,000 Lamborghini. And then I let them vote on whoever they thought was the best answer. And I fixed it up a little bit, better wheels, tires, service, ready to rock. And they voted on a lovely girl from Arkansas who was a nurse, and she dealt a lot with like special needs children, and she wanted to turn it into a Lambulance. And so it is now wrapped like an ambulance in Arkansas, and she gives kids rides in it all the time. And it's absolutely better than anything I could have done with it. And so that kind of thing is ideal.
That's awesome. Well, many times I have heard on the shows that I have watched of yours, you have been notorious for buying flooded cars.
Yes.
Is that really, have you really bought as many flooded cars as people seem to allude to you buying?
I have bought very publicly a couple of badly flooded cars. A Lamborghini Gallardo Spider with a manual transmission, which is a proper rare car, less than 300 of them built for the US, and a Ferrari 599 GTB that was actually the most expensive Ferrari 599 ever to sell at one point. And then I probably bought it as one of the cheapest ones ever to sell after it spent a good amount of time about halfway submerged underwater. And in general, like if you're giving people advice about car buying, you should never, ever buy a flood car. Like when you think about reasons that a car might be devalued, you know, like a minor accident or a lot of miles or a little bit of neglect, those are all like really good, easy to address things that, you know, 2-3 weeks from now, that car could be great. The problem with a flood, especially a saltwater flood, is that the water starts corrosion and that never stops. And so, fortunately, I have been able to sort of indulge the fantasy of not having to worry about what could possibly happen to a terrible car that I might buy through some like sponsored activities like Car Trek, which is a blast. And so for the first Car Trek, our premise was who could buy the coolest, cheap supercar for the price of, at that time in 2000, the newly released mid-engine C8 Corvette. So the new Corvette was kind of famous at the time for having a base MSRP of $59,900. And that's very cheap for the performance and the aesthetic and everything that the car is, you know, relative to the rest of the cars that are available. All of them end up high 80s with options. But regardless, for $59,000, I bought a Lamborghini that the only downside was that it spent a considerable amount of time in a Santa Monica mudslide full of water. And so, you know, if you took any panels off, it was full of dirt. But ultimately, the car ran pretty well. I spent about 10 grand rehabbing the car, put a new clutch in it, you know, serviced everything, changed every fluid. I thought we forgot about the front diff fluid, which once it overheated, it was water. And so overall, yes, I have done some flood cars. Spent a lot of time driving a flood Cayenne for a while because you can get crazy deals. It's still not worth it in most cases, but I've had a few of them.
Well, you mentioned Car Trek, and I mentioned it as well. And I know you and I are both fans of Top Gear, the British version, the old British version of Top Gear. I have watched every episode probably multiple times. Just absolutely love the show. And you've done this thing called Car Trek with a couple of friends of yours. How did Car Trek come about?
So we have a lot of with a YouTube channel, you make money in 3 different ways. You make money from AdSense. Google pays you money for the ads that you guys skip through. We also sell sponsorships. And so those are the ads that we put into the file as we upload them. And then we sell merchandise in those cases. Now, we might put videos on Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or anything else, whatever. But in general, those 3 things account for how I earn a living. And so the sponsors are interesting because a lot of them sponsor a lot of different types of content, right? And so in this case, a sponsor called Auto Tempest, which I'm going to plug right now because it is the best way to search for a used car, and you can search all the major sites at the same time. And it allows me to have a whole lot of fun, but it is honestly how I find a lot of cars because you can do things like search Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist nationally rather than just within like a few miles of your house. And so it is very, very useful in that way, especially when you're kind of looking for the terrible stuff in the deep, dark corners of the internet in terms of the car audience. Like that's where we find it. So they were like, we want to be able to appeal to a bigger audience. And we want to be able to, you know, get our stuff, our name and everything in front of it. So do you have any ideas? And that's a pretty dangerous thing to say around me and my friends. And so a good friend of mine, Freddie Hernandez, had just bought on Craigslist through finding through Auto Tempest for $1,500 Dodge Caravan that had been featured on Pimp My Ride. if you recall that, hosted by X to the Z Exhibit on MTV, where they would like find a school teacher that had a passion for blue jeans and bead making, and they would take her car that she needed for regular transportation and put like an aquarium in it and a giant television. And it wasn't the most legitimate of television shows. In fact, the car that he had was not the car that had been turned in to Pimp My Ride. Like they used different cars and whatever.
Yeah.
But he restored that on his YouTube channel, and it did really, really well. And so he was actually coming through to deliver it to another one of our friends, Tyler Hoover, as a Christmas present in 2019. And so I kind of said, like, well, why can't we have a cheap car contest like they did on Top Gear, like we grew up watching and loving? And they're like, oh, it's a lot of work. We can't do that. I said, why? Why can't we do this thing we want to do that everybody agrees with you is impossible? And so we talked about that with Auto Tempest, and they said, let's try it. And so we had to invent the contest and the premise and the challenge and everything else. And we did that, and it got a lot of views. And we've now done 10 of them. And I mean, literally, it's the most fun you could possibly have while intentionally being miserable in a car. So our Christmas episode, which will probably have just aired by the time that this comes out, is overlanding the Oregon Trail in bad off-roaders. And so I drove a 6x4 Range Rover, so it had an extra axle that didn't participate in mobility other than stopping me from going places I wanted to go. And so we had an absolute blast driving through Oregon and getting stuck a lot. Winching me out, winching the other cars out, stopping them from exploding. And so, yeah, that's Car Trek in a longer than you asked for version.
Oh, my goodness. Well, another thing that, like I mentioned earlier, that you're kind of famous for was your Cannonball run several years ago. When did you come up with the thought, I want to give this a shot?
So when I was in high school,
that's a big deal.
For sure. So I was reading automotive magazines when I should have been studying AP physics in high school. And I, was seeing all these 0 to 60 times and lap times and Nürburgring times and all this stuff. And I was like, I'm more interested in like, what could I drive to grandma's house in Florida the fastest? Because that seems like something I might do tomorrow much more than go to the Nürburgring. And I came home one day and I was like, Dad, what would be really, really cool is if they just took like all the best cars of that year and some good drivers, and they just raced across the country. And he goes, oh, yeah, Cannonball. They've been doing that for like 40 years or something. And I'm like mind blown about the idea that this is a real thing. And so obviously I'm, consumed in the research and the movie and everything else that had happened. And I actually had a period in high school in my senior year of like a directed study or independent study thing where I could sort of pick what I wanted to do research on. And at the time, I thought I might want to be an automotive journalist. It seemed like a great way to try out a lot of cars. It turns out you drive one cool car a year and then spend a lot of time in the latest Ford Fiesta thing or whatever. But that was my research project. And so I called the front desk at Car and Driver, and Brock Yates, who was at the time in the 70s, the editor of Car and Driver magazine, along with Steve Smith, they had started Cannonball, and they ran a real competitive drive across the country as fast as you can, regardless of what the police think about it, race. And I said, hey, can I talk to Brock Yates? I called front desk. The girl says, well, he doesn't really work here, but I'll give you his home phone number. I presume she got fired for that weeks later, but I called him and I said, hey, I want to ask you these questions. I asked him far too many questions for what the circumstance was, but I said, look, I'm really inspired by what you did with Cannonball. I think it's absolutely amazing. And one day I want to set the record and go faster than anybody ever had. And so that would have been in 2004. And in 2001, he'd released a book where in the epilogue, he kind of said, look, it's over. Nobody's going to do it any faster than like 30 hours. That would have been the wall ever. Now there's twice as many cops, twice as many cars on the road. Like it can't be done. And so I said, look, I think it can. I'm a bold, overly ballsy, 18-year-old kid right now. And I'm going to try it. And, little did he know it was going to take 10 years and every dollar that I ever dreamt of having to do so. But I was actually able to go visit him in 2014 And at the time, he had pretty advanced Alzheimer's, and tell him that we had done it, and watch the Bills game with him at a VA home. And I'm now very close with his widow, his wife, Pam Yates. And it's been a tremendous honor in my life to kind of add myself to that and sort of help to usher it into a modern era of what Cannonball looks like today. And fortunately, my YouTube channel, VinWiki, has been sort of the place where people come to tell Cannonball stories. And back in 2016, there was a bit of a reunion where some of the old Cannonballers came together with some of the newer Cannonballers, and we all just got to kind of swap stories. It was very clear that these guys were all just itching for people to listen to these stories, and that their grandchildren were probably very, very tired of it. But I was like, who isn't? The internet. And so I was like, we could start a place where people could tell car stories like these. And, you get to tell them to hundreds of thousands of people rather than just the family reunion or the Thanksgiving table.
Is that how the VinWiki YouTube channel kind of started?
In many ways, yes. So I had sort of started the habit, which I think is probably the healthiest of business habits that I ever accidentally adopted, was about once a quarter, I would get together with some entrepreneurially minded friends, and we would just spitball ideas. And VinWiki, as an app of a way for people to sort of tell the story of their car through Instagram style posts, was one of the ideas that came out of that. And it's really the only one that gained any substantial traction. And then the idea of like, how do we market that? What makes these stories about cars so worth hearing? Came from that reunion. It came from my success in documenting the empirical rarity of manual LP640s to the extent that I was able to buy my dream car for free from the profit of the first one. And also a habit that I had developed of, I just had a personal website at edbolian.com, and I would put a list out there and update it every time I would get a car, and it had all the VINs of all my cars. And so when somebody would buy one years later, they would Google their VIN and they would find me and they'd tell me where it was. And I thought that was just super fascinating. And I found like one of the Ferraris from the rental company had been crashed. One of them had been exported to Europe. The Lamborghini Gallardo that I had first went to Hong Kong. A Land Rover that I'd sold ended up in Puerto Rico. The guy was like, is there anything I can do to make it stop leaking oil? I was like, well, like all Land Rovers, it'll stop when it's empty. And those types of things were really interesting moments in the story of the car. And it meant a lot to me as an enthusiast owner to be able to see kind of the broader picture of what the cars were after we kind of parted ways. And so I really, really enjoyed that. So really it was those things that sort of culminated in the idea of the app, which needed some marketing into the YouTube channel.
So when you've had a checkered car history, we mentioned kind of your favorite. What is kind of the wildest car, or the maybe the worst car you've ever decided to get?
So we've done a lot of premises for Car Trek, and we wanted to do one on importing cars, because the way that the U.S. motor vehicle law works is you can import cars once they're 25 years old and nothing matters. You can import a bicycle with a rocket engine on it as long as it has a VIN. And so, 25 years old cars are now 97, 98 model year cars. And so we imported cars at the time that were up to model year 1996. And in 1996, we had kind of the first modern-ish TVR. It was a Cerbera. And I bought one that was from an era that the British call the Max Power era. And it's a time where they were excessively modifying cars that didn't need modification, didn't deserve the modifications that they received. And so I bought like the poster car of mid-90s British culture. And it is the worst and most unreliable car that I've ever made it somewhere in. And it was so bad. It was painted chameleon orange with speakers everywhere that obviously didn't work. It had a multi-step starting sequence. It ran on like 3 or 4 of its 8 cylinders at a time. And the headlights would not work. The taillights would not work. The turn signals would not work. It was atrocious. And, TVR,
just watching that episode,
memory of John Travolta firing machine guns out of the top of a Tuscan and Swordfish. and that's like a real thing. But and they were in Gran Turismo and the games that we played growing up. But like that, several 100-mile road trip of misery was really like it. Like I sold it to a great guy in Tampa that loves the car amongst his other weird cars. But I would say that's probably the weirdest and worst car.
Yeah, I saw that episode, and I could almost feel your pain. It was very palpable on video that this was not a joyful experience for you.
Well, you'll love 10 because our main editor sent everybody a message. He's like, in case you're wondering, we have found Ed rock bottom in this car in its helpless state, and my inability to make it move. But that's the fun of it. Like, just imagine what infrastructure could allow you to fearlessly embark towards the worst possible outcomes of the hobby that you continue to want to love. Like, it's the parachute, really. It's the guardrails that keeps things from going badly. And that's what it is. And so I would say that as proud as I am of the Cannonball record, and as much as that's meant to me, like the body of work that Car Trek has been really the ultimate manifestation of my childhood gearhead fantasy.
Awesome. Well, faith is a big part of our show, and you are a believer, and you don't seem too shy about sharing that from time to time. How has that played into what you've done with cars? Have you been able to share much there, or is that something that just kind of happens from time to time?
For me, it's always been like the perfect foot in the door, right? Like, people are a whole lot more ready to listen to the guy that pulled up in a Lamborghini at the gas station than they are to pull out the Gideon Bible at the Motel 6 and start reading it, right? And so if we can start a conversation that way and steer it towards that, look, yes, it's awesome. It's way worse than you think it is, but it's definitely an awesome car. But really, look, this isn't where my treasure is. If you want to sit in it, if you want to take your picture in it, if you want to rev it, I don't care. Other than the fact that I know how fragile it is. Not all of them, just mine. And so, like, let's just try not to break it. And so I try as much as I can to let people understand that you don't have to be some rock star to live out a lot of the cool and fun things of this world. Now, it doesn't mean that we need to idolize them. It doesn't mean that, because what we really need to prioritize is this. It's what Jesus did for us. It is what a very simple and easy to understand explanation of substitutionary death and salvation can absolutely mean. And so I have absolutely loved the chance to sort of translate a lot of those conversations towards faith-based discussion. And it's worked really, really well. I think I'm about to do our 12th Disciple Now weekend at our church, and just the chance to, again, have a platform that makes young people listen is a great way to steer them towards God. And I remember, again, that same blog where I list all the VINs of my cars. One day I just made a post. I was like, guys, I'm a Christian, and here's what that means. And I broke down the key reference verses that understood sin, grace, repentance, that I need to constantly remind myself of, and the chance to put that in front of people that wouldn't normally see that in their news feed on social apps is really, really awesome. And I, love, a great part of it is I get a lot of persecution from it, which is a feather in our cap, as I'm told.
Well, I love it when people can take their nerdy pursuits and blend their faith with it in some way. And that's really the big part of what this show is all about. And I'm super honored that there are car guys out there who are strong believers who want to be able to share their faith and get that opportunity.
I am so, over the moon privileged to have had the opportunity. And it's, it's so fun when that kind of precedes you. Like we just did a video of us reading the mean comments from
I
Car Trek,
I
and
literally just watched that today.
I don't remember it verbatim, but I got one that it was like it didn't say me by name, but it was obviously aimed at me, and it
Yes.
said that, the only thing worse than somebody vile and racist enough to vote Republican is somebody who's stupid enough to believe in God. And responded, I was like, I don't know who hurt you, but I have a feeling that a smaller government and a loving creator could help fix it. And, just look, if we want to be a light to the world and maybe some salt in its wounds, I feel like, this is where it starts is, living out a life where people can believe that certainly cars are a huge part of my life on a daily basis, but very much so my relationship with God, supersedes that in every possible way. And, it's been a huge thing to be able to find chances to weave that in. Right. So like, look, we release every weekday a car story video, but last Christmas, it was me reading Luke 2 because I said, well, somebody's going to watch today. And, it obviously YouTube suppresses it and it makes, gets a lot less traction than you want it to, but it's still meaningful. And, I haven't yet decided, because we're filming this before Christmas, what I'll do for a week from Sunday, but, whatever I can. I will say that I want to read the Bible as a series of YouTube videos, which, unless you do King James Version, it's a little bit tough from a copyright perspective. If you can believe it, it's very expensive to record the Bible on the internet. But I'll figure that out at some point. I remember Johnny Cash recorded the Old Testament for his mother as a Christmas present one year, and I just thought that was the coolest thing that ever happened. So,
well, you do have a great voice for it.
Well, you do too. That's something I didn't really know about myself until I started telling stories on the internet. But, occasionally I'd order a sub at Publix and the lady would be like, "Ooh, you got a great voice, to say something else." I don't know, extra meat. And they, so it's been fun to sort of learn. And when I watch my videos from a few years ago, I'm like, woof, that was a lot of ums and uncertain words. Like we could have made that a whole lot quicker, Ed, but it's a process, it's a learning, and I think we're getting somewhere.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this: what is there a particular car that you have not yet had the opportunity to own that you've really been like, this is something that one day I would love to have this, even if it was just for a short while?
I do. And some of them have become fixtures. And there is something about cars that, as much as we grow up and we get removed from it, they can never be as cool as the cars that were cool when you were like 16 to 20 years old. And it's what changes the trends in investing in cars. And that's a very, air quote word, but like it causes value shifts in cars as the people who loved them when they were posters gain the ability or the credit to be able to buy something. And so for me, it was a Lamborghini Murcielago. It's the naturally aspirated V12 Lamborghini from 2001 to 2010. They made 4,099 of them, and they're the best thing that was ever done by humanity in manufacturing as far as I care. But I bought my first one in 2012, and I bought my first one with a manual transmission, which is much more rare, a couple years later in 2014. And it was a real crisis because like I was way too young to have achieved everything I dreamt of in life. And like, that's a weird place to be as a person, much less a Christian. And so we're motivated professionally by a lot of these goals like that. And I tell people all the time, those goals are fine. Like, you don't need to destroy yourself if you don't meet those goals. But having goals like that sort of carry you through your professional life is a big, big deal. And it's okay. But when I ran out of them, it was like, well, what on earth is next? And so I had to make the goal of like, well, I'm going to buy a Bugatti because I like them too. And I have come dangerously close to like consolidating a bunch of cars because I kind of have 3 of my favorite car now because they continue to go up in value and they don't always work. And so it's nice to be able to know that one of them will pull out of the garage if I ask it to. And so I've thought about consolidating into what is a 7-figure car, really good. It was the fastest car in the world from 2006 to 2016, and I haven't done it. I've come real close. So one day I'd like to have one, but more so as a trophy than as the purest expression of what I love about cars. I do love driving them; they're exceptional, but I don't. I really want one because I need to want one as much as I don't need to want one, if that makes as little sense as I hope it does to all of you.
Yeah, I kind of get that. It's it's the I'm always on the chase for who will be my next podcast guest.
Sure.
And now I have the great Ed Bolian.
It's all downhill from here.
But what do you do once you have reached the one goal that you set yourself for, and then what's the next big goal, and is it something that you actually even want? I'm big on goal setting in general. I go through a goal setting process every year about this time, so I definitely can appreciate that. What do you do once you've reached your major goal? You have to find a new goal. But
and by the grace of God, I've got a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old that occupy a tremendous amount of that spectrum. And so, and even in the absence of them, like the opportunity to help grow our church has been the biggest treasure of it all. I was looking back on it because we joined a local First Baptist church back in 2010. And so we'd been married at the time for, I don't know, a year and a half. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to the fact that there is no greater misery in the world than church shopping. And so we had bounced to so many different churches that were great in their own regard, but they just didn't really, fit what we were looking for in terms of community, in terms of the, real treatment of Scripture and everything else. And so we ended up finding this church and joining it, and the newlywed class was all people whose prayer requests were all how sick their kids were. And as real newlywed people, I was like, I don't care about that right now. I want to find somebody to go to dinner with on Tuesday and on vacation with a couple times a year. Like, that sounds much more my speed. So we started that class, and now when we have people over, I take all the cars out of the garage and we just set up tables and chairs, and we'll have 200 people here at the house, and it's amazing. And we're those people now, but it took a long time for us to get there where all the kids are sick and all of us have those types of prayer requests. But over the course of that 12 years now, we've had, I don't know, 100 to 150 couples through the class that have either stayed or moved to other parts of the country or world. 0 divorces. And I actually wrote a thing as a tribute to my wife recently, because she really is the backbone of that class socially, and just in making sure that everybody knows how loved they are and how important they are in our lives. And I was like, in a world where we're told that 50% of marriages end in divorce, unfortunately, amongst, people who profess a relationship with God, that number drops. But at the end of the day, it's bleak, the future of marriage. But to say that, look, it's not to say that we haven't failed. There have been failures in these relationships, but the fact that they're all still together, there's no divorces in this group of people, is incredible. And it's something that I'm proud of her for. I'm proud of everybody for. And it doesn't mean that we don't wake up, ready to kill each other every once in a while. But at the end of the day, we found reasons not to. And hopefully a big part of that reason is the community that we found in each other and in the relationship with God.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned a local church. I'm big on encouraging people to get involved in local churches. I know in the nerd community, a lot of people are a little more introverted and aren't necessarily outgoing enough to to check out local churches sometimes, but I definitely encourage everybody out there to get involved in a local church somehow. There's definitely, whatever your nerd thing is, there is definitely a way you can serve in a local church.
And that's the great part of it is, we grew up in a world where there were 3 churches on every street corner and they were denominationally divided. And then many times today they're, genre divided, where I have a great friend and former pastor that now leads chapel at motocross events. I know a family that leads devotion before every Formula Drift event. And like, whatever it is, exactly the way you said it, whatever your nerd thing is, there's other nerd people that want to do it. And I'll tell you, don't ever be afraid of your introversion. I am very much an introvert, and I very much married an extrovert who wants to see people constantly. And, I'll be out at a car event and I'll take hundreds of pictures with people and sign autographs and have a blast and be just unbelievably flattered by the attention. And then I need to go sit in a quiet, cool, dark place for a while, a meaningful amount of time, in order to sort of recharge from that. And so, exactly. Don't be afraid, but just understand that, in order for us to be the hands and feet of God, we have to engage with the little C church to make sure that, we can equip people to be the most powerful versions of themselves for the furtherance of the gospel.
Absolutely. Well, Ed, it has been a joy having you on the show this week. How can people keep up with what you're doing?
Pretty easy to find. Ed Bolian or VinWiki on most of the platforms, and at the First Baptist Church of Alpharetta if you're close.
Well, and I will definitely put links down in the show notes below for people who want to check out your stuff. Once again, Ed, it has been a joy having you.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. It's an honor to be here, and I can't wait to see where the podcast goes from here.
It was so much fun having Ed on the show this week. If you want to follow Ed and check out some of his videos, I've put links down in the show notes below. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, click all those buttons down below, whatever they are, so you can keep up with the new content as we release it. And you can find all of our social links to our YouTube channel and our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. If you enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. We changed all of our Patreon levels last year, and all of them have great benefits and make a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers that we're serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or to partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click on support in the menu. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Romans 15. May the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you the same attitude of mind toward each other that Christ Jesus had, so that we, with one mind and one voice, may glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey.